Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about Unholy Death Knight. And Unholy has not gotten quite the attention that Frost has, so I'm making this guide second, but it is still a very fun spec to play, and I'm very excited to be making this guide for you guys. Now, Unholy is a little different from Frost in the sense that you are not just walking around with a big ass rune blade, you are summoning ghouls, you are using diseases, and you and your pal Bone Slobber, or as I like to call Great's mom, uh, go into most dungeons doing obscene 1.5 minute burst, and it can be really satisfying, lead to some crazy numbers. So I highly recommend people to give this spec a try. We're going to go through all the different talents. We're going to go through the different stats, gearing, all that sort of stuff. So feel free to skip around in the timestamps, and let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, we're going to kick things off with talents. Now, for the Unholy talents for single target, this is going to be the build that you will run. So some of the big changes that we've seen this season are Unholy's gotten some new talents. We now have a choice Plague Mastery or Grave Mastery. Grave Mastery increases the critical strike damage of your minions, and Plague Mastery increases the critical strike chances of your damage of your diseases. Now, the thing about this is that it is actually going to make it so that Unholy scales better over time, like over in the expansion when we get more and more secondary stats, because now crit actually has a use in our kit. So I'll talk a little bit more about this when we go into gearing, but crit is no longer a bad stat. It's not your best, but it's not a bad stat, and it's just going to be a choice between extra disease damage and extra pet damage. Now, some of the other changes that we have are Clawing Shadows and Plaguebringer used to be on a choice node together, but they are no longer. You can now get Clawing Shadows, which makes it so that your main attack, Scourge Strike, is now ranged and deals shadow damage, which ignores armor and scales with your mastery, so it's a really good buff. You can also grab Plaguebringer at the same time, which is whenever you use that ability, it makes it so that your diseases tick 100% faster. Unholy's diseases don't scale with haste, so they don't tick faster with haste like Feral Bleeds or Aflock Dots or anything like that. So Plaguebringer is a really good ability, and it's really cool that you can now grab both. Another thing you may notice is that we have All Will Serve. So All Will Serve is going to be this little archer guy that you summon. You might remember him as a little skeleton archer. He got a bit of a glow up. He's now a Mount Drax's model, which is kind of cool. And he does good single target. He has an AoE sort of component to him, but it's not very good. So unfortunately, you are only going to be running him in single target. This season, the Magus of the Dead, you will notice very quickly, these guys deal a lot of damage this season, which is really cool because we end up running this pet build. I think for Unholy, thematically, the pet build is cooler. I like it more. Something about being the plate melee necromancer is kind of badass, I think. So I'm glad we end up running this build. So I'm going to show you if you are, that was single target, but if you are in the raid and you know that ads are going to be spawning, so it's a fight where you're fighting one boss and he's spawning in waves of ads, the only change you're going to make is you're going to swap over from your little skeleton guy, I know, kind of unfortunate, over to this ability, which is going to make it so that your Magus of the Dead, they cleave, they do extra cleave damage. Like I said, they do a lot of damage this season, so this is a very good ability. But that is really the only change that you're going to make from single target to single target with cleave. Now, if you are in Mythic Plus and you are not doing the raid and you're trying to run some keys, this is going to be the build that you want to run right here. So some of the changes that we have are we're taking Festering Scythe, which gives you wound generation and AoE, and Bursting Sores, which makes it so that your wounds deal more damage, so those synergize really well together in AoE. Now, Another change that we made over here, you may notice, is that we swapped off of Ray's Abomination to this new ability, Legion of Souls. So Legion of Souls is it's the same animation as Slappy Hands or Abomination's Limb, if you remember that at all. But what it does is it does a bunch of AoE damage, and it applies wounds to the targets. So how you're going to think about this choice right here is in single target, Raise Abomination. In AoE, you're going to run Legion of Souls. So that's kind of the choice node there. They both do very respectable damage. They're just sort of for different purposes. So that is what your builds are going to look like for the Unholy tree. Now, for Rider of the Apocalypse versus Sand Lane, this season, Rider of the Apocalypse is better. So I'm very happy about this because, like I said, for Unholy, I really like the summoning all of your different undead minions and all that kind of stuff. I think it's cool. This tree is effectively passive. I know people get mad about that, but it is effectively passive. You're just kind of going to summon a bunch of different horsemen that are going to do different stuff. Synergizes really well with your tier sets because we have hero talent tier sets this season. But you also get a horse, so kind of cool. Instead of Death's Advance, you now have this ability, Death Charge, which lets you ride around on a horse. It's really nice. And some of the other things, you're going to choose Fury of the Horsemen over Feast of Souls. In PvP right now, you run Feast of Souls, and whenever I make a PvP guide, I'll cover that. But in PvE right now, you want this one. Just want to touch on the choice nodes a little bit. Sand Lane. For Sand Lane, this is what they ran last season. It is not as good this season. Essentially, how it functions is you have this ability called Essence of the Blood Queen that you try and stack up and stack up and stack up, and when you're at max stacks, it increases the damage of your Death Coil. We've had some Death Coil changes and some minion changes, and so with the tier sets and these changes, this build is just a little bit better. You can absolutely run Sand Lane, especially in Mythic Plus, if you just hate Rider of the Apocalypse for whatever reason. But right now, Rider is better. So that's in single target and in AoE. Alright guys, and now let's talk about Unholy rotation. So if you watched any of the other Death Knight guides or you played Death Knight before, you may already be familiar with the resources that it manages. But if you're coming in as a completely new Death Knight player, I don't want to leave you behind, so I'm going to explain them again, just so you're not confused. So Death Knight has two main resources that it manages: runes, which are these little circles below the health bar, and runic power, which is this sort of bar below the health bar right here, this blue one. So how it works is some abilities cost runes and some cost runic power. So for example, Clawing Shadows costs a rune. When I spend a rune on Clawing Shadows, it generates some runic power. When I spend the runic power on Death Coil, it has a chance to refresh a rune. So these sort of have a synergy with each other, and that's sort of the gameplay loop, is you're trying to manage spending your runes for runic power, spending your runic power for runes, and it goes back and forth. Unholy is a little different than Frost because it has a new resource that it manages, and that is Festering Wounds. So as you can see here on the target, we have this stacking debuff on him, right? Festering Wound. So this stacks up to 6. This resource stacks from either your pets attacking, or can stack manually by pressing the ability Festering Strike, which costs 2 runes. This wounds is essentially, it's not like a damage over time, okay? So I know it looks like a debuff on the target. It doesn't do any damage until you cash it in, okay? Until you make it do damage. So these wounds stack up on the target, and by pressing Clawing Shadows, you can pop the wound, you can blow up the wound, and it does extra shadow damage. Now, it doesn't do a crazy amount of damage right now or anything, but it does do enough to matter. It does enough to, like, have you actively manage it, okay? So You stack these wounds, like I said, with either pet auto attacks or festering strikes, and you pop them by pressing Clawing Shadows. Does a little extra damage. Now, the trick with managing these is that you never want to press Festering Strike if you have more than a couple wounds on there. And the reason is because, again, it comes from your pet's auto attacks. And Festering Strike costs 2 runes. So it's not very efficient to use Festering Strike. It doesn't use a lot of damage. It doesn't do a lot of damage, Festering Strike, and it costs 2 runes. Doesn't generate a ton of runic power. It's not a good ability to press. You don't really want to press it very often if you can get away with it. So we're at 4 wounds here, so I would not press Festering Strike. But if we got down to, say, 1 wound, okay, now it's worth pressing, right? Okay, so hopefully that part makes sense to you guys of how to manage your runes, or your wounds, excuse me. But they cap out at 6. You don't want to overcap them. You don't want to be letting them sit here at 6 because your pet could be autoing and you're missing damage because it's capped at 6. And you also don't want to be pressing Festering Strike to bring it potentially above 6 because it only caps at 6. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, moving on to the next the next thing. So you may see I'm getting some procs right now. So what are these? These are Death Coil procs. You can store up to 2 of them. So we have 2 right now, 1 on each side. How it works is it makes it so that your Death Coil will pop a wound. So you press it, it pops a wound, just like Clawing Shadows. And because of our talents, it will also make us summon these little Maguses of the Dead who do a ton of damage. So this, when you get those procs, is your #1 priority. So outside of the proc window, your main rotation is really just going to be spending your runic power on Death Coil and then popping wounds with your Clawing Shadows. You want to maintain your diseases at all times with Outbreak. Most of the time, you're not going to have to worry too much about diseases because your pets from your Raise Abomination and from your Apocalypse are going to apply those diseases anyways. But just make sure you never want to be missing damage, so just make sure that they always have the disease debuff on them. We keep that active with Outbreak. Now, how it's going to work in AoE versus single target is in single target, you are going to be using Death Coil as your main spender, which shoots out this cool little ranged ability. It's like this little ranged green coil skull thing. It's pretty sweet. And in AoE, you are going to be using Epidemic. Now, Epidemic is going to make it so that whatever targets have your diseases on them get hit by this ability. So that is, when you press it, it will summon one of these guys just like Death Coil will. But maintain your diseases on those targets so that when you press Epidemic, it hits all of them. So that's going to be the only difference with AoE and single target, is that in AoE with, say, 3 or more targets, you are going to be pressing Epidemic, and if it's 1 or 2 targets, you're going to be pressing Death Coil. That's really it for ranged versus the single target. The only other thing to keep in mind is that Death and Decay. So Unholy still uses Death and Decay, even though Frost does not. Death and Decay is an ability that you need to put down because it will make it so that your Clawing Shadows cleaves any targets in that area. So if I hit this one target with Clawing Shadows, it hits both of them. So bear that in mind. Now we're going to talk a little bit about your cooldowns. How it's going to work for your cooldowns is you have a crazy 1.5 minute burst, and then you have a decent 45-second burst. But your Raise Abomination is going to summon a bunch of horsemen and deal a bunch of damage. And then you are going to use Unholy Assault at the same time, which gives you a 20% damage amp. So this is going to be a crazy amount of damage that you're going to put out. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be raising your Abomination. You're going to be pressing Apocalypse. and you're going to be pressing Unholy Assault. And now you have all of your ghouls hitting the guy at the same time. And during this, because your Abomination is also going to be popping or applying wounds, you don't really need to worry too much about pressing Festering Strike. You want to be focused on using your Death Coil procs to summon more of these guys and pressing Clawing Shadows. So see, I'm not really even having to apply Festering Strike, we just had enough wounds there anyway. Outside of your burst, you may need to, in single target, you may need to be pressing Festering Strike. In AoE, okay, this is important, guys. In AoE, you really don't need to be pressing Festering Strike at all. You're going to generate enough wounds passively, as long as you keep Death and Decay down, keep your diseases on the targets, and you're going to apply enough wounds just by existing, okay? So it's not something you're going to have to focus on in AoE. But in single target, it is a resource that you're going to have to manage and worry about. For defensive cooldowns, you have Anti-Magic Shell, which is this sort of shell that you put around yourself, and it prevents harmful magical effects from being applied and gives you an absorb shield against magic damage. It's on a short cooldown. Use it in every pull. Every time you guys pull in Mythic Plus, use that ability. You have Icebound Fortitude, which is a flat wall and prevents stuns. It's a pretty good defensive on a 2-minute cooldown. And you also have Lichborn, which makes you immune to Charm, Fear, and Sleep, and gives you a bit of Leech, which makes it so that you're healing yourself during that sort of defensive use. And you also have Anti-Magic Zone, which is the zone that hopefully your team can stand in when magic damage is incoming. You want to kind of use that when you know a big magic ability is coming out. Finally, we also have Soul Reaper. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. It is Unholy's sort of execute damage. Now, when a target is below 35% health, you're going to apply Soul Reaper to the target. You're only really worried about this in single target. Don't worry about it in AoE, in an AoE pull in Mythic Plus. Only really press it in single target. But Soul Reaper is going to, after a couple seconds, it is going to blow up. If they're below 35% health, it'll do a bunch of damage, and it will make your minions deal 10% increased damage. So your minions start shredding someone, they're taking extra damage from your execute, and you have a really cool execute phase. That is about it for the Unholy rotation. Alright guys, and now we're going to talk a little bit about stats and gearing. Now, I'm going to explain to you all of the secondary stats and sort of where they are on the rank of importance. Now, Critical Strike used to be a terrible stat. Critical Strike, it had no synergy with Unholy at all, and this kind of sucked for Unholy later in expansion, because eventually, if you didn't know this, all of these have they have diminishing returns once you reach a certain amount. So if you get over a certain amount of mastery, it starts becoming less valuable. If you get over a certain amount of haste, it starts becoming less valuable. And so Unholy was reaching a point where they were just going for diminishing returns on their stats because crit was so bad it didn't have any synergy for them. So it put them behind, and they ended up having to get like a ton of buffs at the end of each expansion. Blizzard fixed this. They fixed this by adding these talents here, which are Grave Mastery and Plague Mastery, which increase the critical strike damage of your diseases and the critical strike damage of your minions. So now critical strike is not a bad stat at all. It's not your number one stat. It's not the stat that you're going to take above everything else, but it's good. It's okay. Critical strike increases the chance that your abilities are going to critically strike, and then you have a damage amp on the critical strikes. Now, you may be wondering, okay, but why are the diseases a 25% damage amp, and why are the minions a 15% damage amp? That's a big difference. Why is that? The reason for this is that haste scales really well with your minions, okay? So how this works, how haste works for Unholy. The haste is going to be your best stat, by the way. So haste, what it does is it increases your attack speed, which gives you more death coil procs, because death coil procs come from your auto attacks. So more auto attacks, more death coil procs. It also increases the attack speed of all of your minions. So all of the ghouls that you summon, all of the skeleton archers that you summon, all of the maguses that you summon, all of the abominations and riders that you summon, your main ghoul that you summon, all of it increases their attack speed. And when you have a target getting swarmed by the entire Scourge itself, it's going to do a lot of damage. So that is why the Grave Mastery damage amp is lower, is because Unholy synergizes really well with haste for that reason. A lot of specializations, their damage over times scale with haste, like Affliction Warlock and Feral Druid. Their diseases tick faster when you have more haste, but the damage over times, the diseases for Unholy don't. So it's just the pets. But haste is a very, very good stat for the death coil procs, for the rune regeneration, for the the pet auto attack speed. It's just a very, very good stat. Mastery is going to be your second best stat, and it's pretty close to haste, because what it does is it increases the damage of all of your minions. It's a flat damage buff for all of your pets. Congrats, that's a lot. It also increases the shadow damage of your abilities, which are all of your diseases. And by the way, Clawing Shadows, shadow damage. Death Coil, shadow damage. Soul Reaper, your execute, shadow damage. All your stuff is shadow damage, and all your stuff that's not shadow damage, that's physical damage, is your pets. So it's a flat damage increase. It's just really good. So you get the haste, right? To make it so that they attack faster, and then you get mastery so that they do more damage when they attack. And you kind of want to mix of those. So you want to hit a good amount of haste that feels comfortable. I hate giving percentages, guys. I don't like doing it, because people are going to get weird gear and they're going to be like, hey, this, you said go this amount of haste, but then they have lower. Don't worry too much about that. Try and get a good amount of haste where it feels smooth, it feels comfortable, and then get a bunch of mastery. And if you have some crit on some pieces, it's fine. It's okay. It's a good stat. Now, some of the other things, the tier set. So I mentioned already, the tier sets are going to scale with your hero talents this season. So not just your spec, but your hero talent trees. Unholy's, what it does is it's going to make it so that Apocalypse summons one of the riders and makes it so they do a bunch of extra damage, and your Death Coil is going to do extra damage to targets that rider is hitting. So it's a good set. It's a big boost. You'll just try and grab it on whatever pieces you can as soon as you can, because it is a big bonus. As far as trinkets go, your best trinket right now is one of your best trinkets is Cursed Stone Idol. So the reason I'm bringing this up, I usually try and not tell people exactly which trinkets to get, because they're all good in different situations, Mythic Plus versus Raid and all that. But I will talk about this one, because it's good in Mythic Plus and it's good in Raid. And Cursed Stone Idol, I see a lot of people asking questions about this and when to use this. This ability you want to be using, it's a 1 second channel, which is a really weird thing. So you can't really macro it to anything on Unholy. You kind of need a separate keybind for it. But how you're going to use it is you're going to use it right before you send your damage, right? So if I'm doing my little damage window, right, I'm pressing it as I'm walking into the pack of targets. I'm pressing it, and then I'm sending all my burst, right? Then I'm sending all my damage. Okay? So I just wanted to mention that, because something to be aware of. Now, we're also going to talk about your Runeforge. Now, for Runeforges, Rune of the Fallen Crusader is your best Runeforge for your weapon. Make sure it's applied. It's really, really good. Rune of the Apocalypse is actually pretty close for pure single target to Rune of the Fallen Crusader. This is the first time in a very, very long time that it's been close in damage, but Fallen Crusader is still better. and it's better in Mythic Plus. So that is going to be the Runeforge that you want to run. Alright guys, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully, if you are new to DK, you learned something. Or if you're a returning DK, you feel confident going into your keys and your raid progression. If you guys have any questions, leave a comment below. If you want to see anything else, if there's anything that you feel like would merit a video that you'd like to see, just let me know. I do this for fun. I'm down to make a video if it would help you. The last thing that I will say to Blizzard, if they are watching, if there's a developer that is watching this and trying to learn how to play DK, if they're switching from mage, right? What I will say is, where's the pet customization? I'm still waiting on it. Every Unholy video I make, I'm gonna bring this up. Where is the pet customization, Blizzard? I still want to be able to change my ghoul. But all right, thank you guys again for watching, and suffer well.